one of the biggest impacts on how well your church recruits volunteers or not is the structure of the teams. One of my mentors, Jim Weidman, in his book Stretch, he talks about how every ministry is either running a maintenance structure, meaning it's just maintaining, it's just enough to keep it where it is right now, or it's a growth structure, meaning it could grow and get larger and get bigger because of the structure that is in place. So, one game changer for recruiting more volunteers is implementing volunteer coaches. Volunteer coaches are just volunteers. It's one volunteer who leads other volunteers. And that could look a number of different ways. In our church, we have a preschool coach who leads, let's say, 3 rooms of preschool leaders, preschool volunteers, and they lead all 3 of those rooms. And maybe that includes 12 volunteers. And that's their role as a coach. And they do that at one service. And then maybe another preschool coach is leading another 3 rooms at the same service. And then another coach, another preschool coach, might be leading the same 3 rooms, but at a different service. And you understand what I mean. In student ministry, you might have a middle school boys small group coach. And that person leads all the middle school guys, small group leaders. Same for large group. Maybe it's an elementary large group coach, and they lead all of the hosts and worship leaders and storytellers who are on stage during large group in the elementary environment. In worship arts, like in your main service, maybe a coach leads the bands. One coach leads a band that is, leading worship that morning at church, and maybe they lead that same band and they're leading once a month. So, a coach in adult small group ministry might lead 15 adult small group coach leaders or something like that. So that's all it is. A coach is a volunteer who leads other volunteers. And we're going to talk about why it's important to recruiting. The name isn't important. We call it a coach in my church. With Ministry Boost, all the tools and courses and resources we provide, we tend to refer to this as a coach, but the name isn't important. You could call it a coordinator, director, boss. Don't call it a boss. That's just a joke. But I've seen churches use different names here. That doesn't matter. I mean, pick something that makes sense and is clear. But the key is just picking a term and sticking with it. In the Bible, in the book of Exodus, chapter 18, Moses is visited by his father-in-law, Jethro, who wants to help him out because Moses is overwhelmed. There's so many people. The nation is so big. There's so many disputes, and everything is coming back to him. And that was me as a church leader. Not that it was that many people, certainly, but you may have experienced that too, that you might lead 18 volunteers, and maybe it feels like that's fine. You can lead 18 volunteers. If I were leading 18 volunteers, I could handle that. That would be enough that I could handle that. But ideally, I would even start to put some coaches in place there. And, one coach would lead 9 or 10 and I'd lead the other 9 or 10, or I'd get 2 coaches, and each one of them's leading 9 and then I'm leading them. But if you had 30 volunteers, if you had 60 volunteers, because your church is larger and your ministry is larger, I remember when our church grew after we started it, and the kids ministry volunteer team grew, which was a great thing, from 30 to 60. Well, I wasn't leading it well at 30, leading all 30 volunteers by myself. So I certainly wasn't leading it well at 60. So I was kind of like in the same position in Exodus chapter 18 where I needed a structure. And Jethro tells Moses, what you're doing is not good. Something no man wants to hear from his father-in-law, by the way. What you're doing is not good, which it wasn't good. And he helped him implement a structure: leaders of 10s, leaders of 50s, leaders of 100s, leaders of 1000s. It's all about creating a leadership structure for your volunteers. And going back to Jim Weidman's quote in the book, you want to create a growth structure that will allow your team to grow as you recruit more volunteers. So how do you do it? Redesign your volunteer teams with volunteer coaches in mind. So let's just say you lead a team of 40 volunteers. That I like to use the number 10, that a coach could lead about 10 people. Now, it might be 5, it might be 13. Again, you don't want too many. You probably don't want too few, but somewhere in that 5 to 15 number is usually pretty good. But let's just say it's 10. You have 40 volunteers. You're going to divide them up into roughly 4 teams, and you need 4 coaches. I would allow your ministry and the structure of the ministry to be a big factor in how you divide the teams up. So for example, it doesn't have to be exactly 10. It might be that you have 2 services, and we're talking children's ministry, let's say. You have 2 services, and there's, roughly 20 volunteers serve at each service. And I'm going to say, let's say 6 of them serve in elementary and 14 in preschool. The numbers, if you're losing track with the numbers, don't worry about it. Well, one coach might lead the 6 elementary leaders at the one service, and then one coach might lead 14 preschool leaders at that same service. And then at the next service, you have a coach that leads the elementary, 6 leaders and the 14 preschool leaders. They're not even, right? The preschool person's leading more people. So, you may need another preschool coach sooner. But the point is, make your structure make sense with how your ministry works. It wouldn't make any sense in that example I just gave to say, I need 4 coaches. They all have to lead exactly 10 leaders. So you're going to lead 6 elementary and 4 preschool. It's like, that doesn't really make sense because you want it to work well, in your environment while that's happening. So redesign your volunteer teams with volunteer coaches in mind. So what would it look like if you divided people up into groups of 5 to 15, whatever that number looks like, and then had a leader for them? Do that first. That will determine how many coaches you need to lead the teams. When I did this, when our ministry had 60 volunteers, I think we ended up with around 8 coaches that we needed. We needed a little bit more than that 1 to 10. And again, some of that was just because we needed more in preschool than we did elementary. We were doing a family experience at the time. We didn't really need as many there just because of the way that worked. So redesign, a new structure with volunteer coaches. Let that determine how many you need, and then invite people to serve as coaches. And you might invite existing volunteers, like somebody that's been a great volunteer. You're going to say, hey, you have done this so well, but the team is growing. We need you to help other leaders do it as well as you did. Can you lead this team of people that were all doing the same thing you were doing, but now you're going to be the coach? And one question I get all the time when it comes to coaches is, can people double dip? So for example, can an elementary small group leader who's leading a group of, let's say, 4th grade guys, can that guy also be the coach for all the elementary small group leaders at that service? The answer is yes, they could. But to me, that's not the ideal plan. The ideal plan is you're eventually getting to where their only job is they're a coach. We have had volunteers that have double dipped like that. They got to be high capacity. They got to be able to give the time. And even then, I don't love it. But if they can do it well, it's like, okay, that can work. I know of a church that implemented coaches fast because this is what they did. They basically didn't recruit any new coaches. They just had existing leaders also be coaches. That is a way to get there quickly. It's just not what I recommend. What I do recommend, though, is, again, going back to my example of, let's say there's the elementary 4th grade guys leader, and I'm going to ask him, let's say his name's Keith, to be a coach for all of the small group leaders at his service. I could say, hey, Keith, we got this new role as a coach. Think you'd be great at it. Invite him into it. And hey, you can double dip from now till the end of the school year, or just for the next 2 months. And during those 2 months, I need you to help me recruit your replacement. I love that. That's a great way to go from somebody serving in this role to serving as a coach role, but then they help you recruit the replacement. And overall, you want to help empower them to recruit volunteers to their teams. So, and if they're recruiting to their team, like, you'd love for them to recruit to everything, right? Like, recruit your large group and to other ministries, that would be awesome. But if they can recruit to their team, they're going to have more ownership of that. So teach them. Here's some ways you can recruit. Who do you know that's not serving, that's a part of our church? Talk to them about it. It's a lot easier, I think, to recruit as a volunteer than it is as staff, because they see you're doing it. You're just inviting them into the same thing they're doing. So empower your new coaches to recruit volunteers to their teams. And then you can use the extra time that you get back, because now they're leading the volunteers you used to be leading. You can use that extra time to recruit more volunteers yourself. And before I forget, one of the key things when it comes to empowering and recruiting volunteer coaches is you want to look for some people that don't even serve in your ministry already. Maybe they lead in their home, in their business, in their company, outside of church, and they're not serving in your ministry. And maybe they wouldn't even serve in a role in your ministry. Like, maybe they wouldn't lead an elementary group as a small group leader. But when it comes to being a coach and leading the adults and students who are volunteering leading those groups, maybe they would say yes to that, because that's a different kind of thing. It's more of a leadership role than it is a small group leader role. Now, they're similar because you want them to care for their few the same way those small group leaders are leading. But the idea is you can get people to serve as coaches who wouldn't normally serve in other roles in your ministry. So make your new structure, figure out how many you need, and then start inviting people to serve in those coach roles. If you need more help with that, one of the courses we have at Ministry Boost is all about this. Actually, a couple of the courses, some of our resources have coach job descriptions and things like that. And there's a membership that we also have where you can kind of get everything for one low monthly cost. But I hope you will implement some type of volunteer coaching structure so that your ministry can grow. Because once you do this, they'll start recruiting more. You'll have time for recruitment. And there's just some connection between expanding that and having a growth structure, as Jim Weidman talks about, versus having a maintenance structure. When we did this in our church and we were stuck at 60 volunteers for a number of years, once we implemented this, it grew. And sometimes it's hard to put your finger on the pulse of that, but I believe there's a connection between giving ministry away to other people, giving leadership and authority away to other volunteers, and the growth of that ministry.